In the small, seemingly tranquil town of Harper's Grove, unsettling tales whispered through the winds, stories that parents used to warn their children to be home before dark. Among these, the legend of the Old Hickory Lane was perhaps the most chilling. The road was infamous not just for its sinister appearance, with gnarled trees that loomed over the path like watchful predators, but for the disappearance of anyone foolish enough to walk its length after sunset. One unseasonably warm October evening, a group of 4 friends, Mia, Tyler, Jenna, and Eric, decided to challenge the superstitions surrounding Old Hickory Lane. Their plan was simple: walk the entire 1-mile stretch of the lane from sunset to darkness, live-streaming their journey to debunk the myths or perhaps confirm them for their online followers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing everything in a reddish-gold light, the friends gathered at the beginning of the lane. They started their live stream, their phones casting eerie glows on their faces as they narrated their adventure. The initial mood was light, filled with laughter and playful jabs at each other's fears. However, as they walked deeper into the lane, the atmosphere shifted. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches scratching at the air like claws. The wind picked up, carrying with it whispers that sounded almost like hushed voices. Mia, who was leading the group, stopped suddenly, causing the others to bump into her. "What's wrong?" Tyler asked, his voice tinged with irritation. "I thought I saw something," Mia replied, her eyes scanning the dense woods that bordered the path. There, between those 2 trees. It looked like a figure. Jenna rolled her eyes. "It's probably just a shadow." "Come on, don't start freaking out now," she said, though her voice faltered slightly, betraying her nerves. Reluctantly, they continued, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Eric, who had been quiet most of the walk, pointed his phone's camera into the woods, trying to capture any unusual movements. As he did so, the screen flickered erratically, and for a moment, it showed a distorted face staring back at them. He yelped and dropped his phone, the screen going black upon hitting the ground. The group gathered around the phone, but when Eric picked it up, the device was dead. "It was fully charged," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. The others exchanged nervous glances, the reality of their situation beginning to dawn on them. Deciding to turn back, they retraced their steps, the darkness deepening around them. The path, familiar just moments before, now seemed alien and menacing. Tyler, trying to lighten the mood, joked about how they were going to be the laughingstock of their followers. His laughter sounded hollow in the cold night air. Suddenly, Jenna screamed. Turning around, they saw her staring at the ground, her face pale and her body rigid. At her feet was a small, tattered doll, its eyes missing and its mouth stitched into a sinister smile. None of them had noticed it on their way in. "How did this get here?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. The wind picked up again, the whispers louder now, almost coherent, as if urging them to leave. They needed no further prompting. As they hurried back toward the entrance of Old Hickory Lane, the sound of footsteps followed them, quickening as they quickened their pace. By the time they reached the end of the lane, all 4 were out of breath, their minds reeling from fear. They agreed to never speak of what happened, to pretend it was just their imagination running wild. But as they drove away, each of them glanced back at the dark path of Old Hickory Lane. The streetlight that illuminated the lane's entrance flickered and went out, plunging the road back into darkness. Days passed, and the friends tried to return to their normal lives, but the night on Old Hickory Lane haunted them. Mia, who had been the most rational of the group, started noticing shadows lurking in the corners of her room at night, disappearing when she turned to look directly at them. Tyler began to hear the faint whispers in the wind, even when indoors. Jenna found more dolls appearing at her doorstep, each more grotesque than the last. Eric, however, suffered the worst. He began to have nightmares of a shadowy figure chasing him down an endless dark road, waking up each night drenched in sweat and screaming. The fear became too much for him to handle alone, and one evening, he called Mia, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Mia, we need to go back to Old Hickory Lane. There's something we left behind, something calling us back there." Reluctantly, Mia agreed, and they decided to return to the lane, this time to confront whatever continued from part 1 they had encountered. Gathering Tyler and Jenna, who were both visibly shaken by the events that had unfolded since that night, they set out once more under the cloak of darkness, a sense of dread settling over them. As they approached Old Hickory Lane, the air grew noticeably colder, a palpable tension surrounding the area as if the lane itself was aware of their return. The streetlight that had flickered off during their last visit remained dark, casting long shadows across the road that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. With a deep breath, Mia led the group down the path once again. This time, they were silent, each step heavy with the weight of their fear. The wind began to whisper again, more insistent this time, and it seemed to carry voices, pleas, warnings, cries of anguish that mingled with the rustling of the leaves. Eric, who had been the most affected by their previous encounter, kept his camera trained on the path ahead, though his hands trembled visibly. As they reached the spot where Jenna had found the doll, they paused. The ground was undisturbed, the doll now nowhere to be seen. "It was right here," Jenna whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear it was right here." They continued deeper into Old Hickory Lane, the darkness enveloping them like a thick blanket. The further they walked, the more the atmosphere seemed to change, the air felt charged, heavy with the presence of something unseen. Suddenly, Tyler stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his eyes wide as he turned his head, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was a low, mournful sobbing, coming from just off the path. Without thinking, Mia walked towards the sound, her friends hesitating before following her. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, as they neared a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a figure hunched over, its body shaking with sobs. As they approached, the figure slowly lifted its head, revealing a face so distorted with grief and pain it was almost inhuman. Its eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on Mia and her friends, sending a chill down their spines. "We're here to help you," Mia said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound calm. The figure stared at them for a moment longer, then, with a sudden, swift motion, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of its sobs and a cold gust of wind that made them shiver. The group stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just seen. The wind picked up again, the whispers returning, louder now, almost angry. "We need to keep moving," Eric said, his voice urgent. He led the way as they continued down the path, each step taking them further into the heart of Old Hickory Lane. As they walked, the whispers seemed to converge into a single voice, clear and chilling, "Leave, while you still can." Ignoring the warnings, they pressed on until they reached the end of the lane, where the trees parted to reveal a dilapidated house that none of them had noticed on their first visit. The house looked ancient, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling off in large strips. Despite its state of disrepair, there was a palpable sense of malevolence emanating from it, as if the building itself harbored a dark spirit. "This wasn't here before," Tyler muttered, his eyes scanning the structure warily. "We have to check it out," Eric insisted, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "Whatever is happening, it's connected to this place." With great reluctance, the group approached the house. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Taking a deep breath, Mia pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was shrouded in darkness, the air stale and cold. They entered slowly, their flashlights cutting through the blackness, revealing a hallway lined with old portraits, their faces scratched out, eyes following them as they moved. As they explored the house, they found remnants of rituals, candles, strange symbols carved into the wood, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. The further they ventured, the colder the air became, until their breaths were visible in the flashlight beams. In the living room, they found a large, dusty book lying open on a decrepit sofa. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with writings in a language none of them recognized. As Mia reached out to turn a page, the house began to shake violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. They stumbled back, watching in horror as the words on the page began to glow with a fiery red light. The house groaned under an unseen force, the air filled with the sound of laughter, dark and menacing. As they raced for the exit, the door slammed shut, trapping continued from part 2, them inside. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the hallways, sending waves of dread through their spines. Desperately, they pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if sealed by an invisible force. Turning back to the interior of the house, they realized their only option was to delve deeper and perhaps find another way out. The structure of the house seemed to defy logic, with hallways that twisted in impossible directions and stairs that led to nowhere. As they navigated through the maze-like corridors, the air grew thick with a putrid smell of decay. Shadows moved just at the edge of their light's reach, and the temperature dropped so drastically that their teeth chattered uncontrollably. Every so often, they would pass mirrors hung on the walls, their reflections distorted and twisted into grotesque versions of themselves. Mia kept a firm grip on her flashlight, her other hand clutching the old book they had found. She hoped it might hold some clue about how to break the curse that seemed to hold the house, and them, captive. As they moved from room to room, searching for any sign of an exit, the house seemed to respond to their presence, doors slamming shut behind them, the sound of footsteps following just behind them, always out of sight. In what appeared to be an old library, they found another book similar to the one Mia carried. This one was open on a pedestal, its pages filled with ancient symbols that pulsed with a dull red glow. As Eric stepped closer to examine it, the room darkened, and the temperature plunged even further. The air around the book began to move, swirling in a pattern that suggested a presence, an intelligence. Jenna, whose fear had turned to fascination, began to read the symbols aloud, her voice steady despite the shivering cold. As she spoke, the house's response intensified, the walls began to bleed, a dark, thick substance that oozed down to the floor. The laughter turned into a cacophony of screams and wails, so loud they had to cover their ears. But amidst the chaos, a section of the wall in the library shifted, revealing a hidden door. With no time to think, they rushed through it, finding themselves in a narrow, descending staircase that spiraled down into the darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the walls damp and the air filled with the scent of mold and earth. As they descended, the sounds from the house above faded into silence, replaced by the dripping of water and their own heavy breathing. Finally, the staircase ended, opening into a large underground chamber. The room was lit by torches that cast flickering shadows on the walls. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, stained with age and darker substances. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with bones, human bones, by the look of them. The reality of where they were hit them like a physical blow. This was no ordinary house, it was a place of ancient rituals, possibly sacrifices, tied to the dark energies that had tormented the lane and now them. Before they could explore further, the sound of the stone door grinding shut echoed through the chamber, sealing them in. They were trapped, the air heavy with the history of the place, suffocating in its intensity. As they gathered around the altar, trying to find some mechanism or clue to open the door or break the cycle, Mia's flashlight flickered over something half-buried in the dirt floor. It was a small, rusted box, its lid adorned with the same symbols they'd seen in the books. With trembling hands, Mia opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a small object that pulsed with a cold light. As she unfolded the cloth, they saw it was a crystal, its facets reflecting the torchlight with an eerie intensity. The moment Mia touched the crystal, a deep, resonant voice filled the chamber, ancient and commanding. "Who dares to wake the sleep of the forgotten?" it boomed, the sound vibrating through the air. Frozen by the sudden intrusion, they could only stare in horror as the shadows around them began to coalesce, forming shapes that were human and yet not, creatures of darkness and despair that had been awakened by their presence. As the figures advanced, the friends realized they were about to confront the very heart of the curse that plagued Old Hickory Lane, a force far more ancient and malevolent than they could have imagined. They braced themselves, knowing that their escape, if it was even possible, would require confronting these shadows head-on. The air thickened, the darkness palpated with malevolent intent as they prepared to fight not just for their freedom, but for their very souls. The battle was about to begin, and the outcome was anything but certain. Continued from Part 3, in the dimly lit chamber, the advancing shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their forms shifting and twisting into more terrifying shapes as they drew nearer. Mia clutched the crystal tightly, the cold from it seeping into her bones, feeling almost as if the crystal itself was alive, its pulse syncing with her heartbeat. Eric, Jenna, and Tyler formed a tight circle around Mia, their eyes darting between the encroaching shadows and the various artifacts scattered around the room, searching desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon or a tool for their defense. The voice boomed again, louder this time, filling the chamber with its omnipotence. "The crystal is the key, but not as you presume," it said, the words echoing off the stone walls, making the air around them vibrate. "What you hold is a lock and a gateway, a power neither to be wielded nor taken lightly." The shadows halted their advance momentarily, as if awaiting the outcome of this revelation. Mia looked down at the crystal, her mind racing. "What do you want from us?" she shouted into the darkness, her voice steady despite the palpable fear. "A trade," the voice replied, its tone smooth as silk yet underlaid with something sinister. "Freedom for freedom. The release of one for the release of many." Jenna gasped, understanding dawning on her. "It wants to be free, to leave this place. And it will use us to do it." Eric stepped forward, his face set in determination. "And if we refuse?" he asked, his voice echoing defiantly in the vast chamber. "Then here you shall remain, as guardians of the gate until another comes to take your place," the voice answered, a hint of amusement in its tone. The group exchanged looks, each face reflecting the gravity of their situation. They were trapped in a nightmare, part of a cycle that had perhaps claimed many before them. Mia tightened her grip on the crystal, feeling its energy pulsating even stronger. "Let's use it," Tyler whispered. "It's a key, right? Maybe we can control it." Mia nodded, closing her eyes to concentrate on the crystal. She could feel its power, a surging force begging to be unleashed. "I need you all with me," she said, reaching at her other hand. Her friends took hold, forming a chain of contact, their combined wills focused on the task at hand. As they stood united, Mia envisioned the crystal's energy as a beacon, a light piercing through the darkness that bound them. She felt the crystal respond, its glow intensifying, casting brilliant rays that cut through the shadows. The creatures hissed and recoiled, the light anathema to their existence. The voice roared in anger as the light grew stronger, the ground beneath them shaking. "You dare defy the covenant?" it bellowed, the chamber shaking with its fury. The crystal's light reached a crescendo, blinding them with its intensity. Then, suddenly, there was silence. The shaking stopped, the light dimmed, and the air felt lighter, as if a great pressure had been lifted. They opened their eyes slowly, blinking against the brightness that gradually receded. The shadows were gone, and the chamber, though still underground, felt less oppressive, the air fresher. "Did we do it? Did it work?" Jenna asked, her voice echoing slightly in the now quiet space. "I think so," Mia replied, looking at the crystal, which had dulled to a soft glow. "But I don't know if we're free yet." They looked around, the chamber now devoid of the sinister presence that had haunted it. However, the doors remained sealed, the way they came in not visibly changed. "We need to find another way out," Eric said, scanning the room for any other exits. As they searched the chamber, they found a series of carvings on the far wall that hadn't been visible before, obscured by the darkness. The carvings depicted scenes of guardianship and sacrifice, but also of liberation and ascent. At the base of this mural, a small, unobtrusive lever was almost camouflaged against the stone. Tyler, upon noticing it, called the others over. "This could be something," he said, his hand hovering over the lever. With a collective nod from his friends, he pulled it, and a low grinding sound reverberated through the walls. A section of the stone floor began to shift, opening to reveal a staircase leading upwards. Heartened by this discovery, they quickly gathered their things, including the now quiet crystal, and ascended the staircase. It wound upwards in a tight spiral, the air growing warmer and fresher with every step. As they reached the top, they found themselves in a small, enclosed grove, the night sky visible through the opening above. Relief washed over them as continued from part 4, they breathed in the cool night air, feeling the weight of the underground chamber lift from their shoulders. The grove was surrounded by thick foliage, the moonlight filtering through the leaves creating patterns on the ground. It seemed they had emerged in a different part of the forest, far from where they had initially entered the haunted house. Mia clutched the crystal tightly, a sense of unease still lingering. "We should move quickly," she suggested. "I don't think we're completely out of danger yet." Her friends nodded in agreement, and they set out through the grove, heading towards what they hoped would be the outskirts of Old Hickory Lane. The forest seemed alive around them, the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the rustling of leaves underfoot accompanying their hurried steps. As they navigated through the dense woods, the moon provided just enough light to guide their path. However, the deeper they went, the more the trees seemed to close in around them, the path narrowing until they were walking single file. Every snap of a twig or distant howl made them jump, their nerves frayed from the night's earlier horrors. Suddenly, Tyler, who was leading, stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. In the distance, a faint light flickered through the trees, like a beacon. They approached cautiously, the light growing brighter as they neared. It was a lantern, hanging from a tree branch, swaying gently as if recently disturbed. Beneath the lantern, etched into the dirt, was a circle of symbols similar to those they had seen in the house. Inside the circle, the ground was scorched, as if by fire, and at the center lay another crystal, identical to the one Mia held. The sight stopped them cold. "This can't be good," Eric muttered, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest warily. Jenna stepped forward, peering at the crystal. "It's like a marker, or a warning," she said. "What do we do?" "We should leave it," Mia advised, feeling a deep, instinctual fear about disturbing another crystal. "Let's just find a way out of these woods." They agreed, stepping around the circle carefully, continuing their trek towards safety. But as they moved away, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of their own breaths and footsteps. Then, without warning, the night erupted into chaos. Shadows detached from the trees, swirling around them with ferocious speed. The air turned cold, biting at their skin, as a dense fog rolled in, obscuring their vision. "They're hurting us," Tyler yelled over the roar of the wind that had suddenly picked up. "Back to the circle!" Eric shouted, realizing their retreat might be their only chance. They fought their way back to the lantern, the shadows snapping at their heels, a tangible sense of malevolence in every gust of wind. Once back inside the circle, the chaos outside seemed to hold, the shadows circling like sharks but not daring to enter. The crystal in the center of the circle pulsed lightly, a gentle glow that contrasted starkly with the darkness beyond the circle's edge. Mia removed her own crystal from her pocket, the two stones reacting to each other's presence. As she held hers out, both crystals began to glow brighter, resonating with a frequency that made the ground beneath them hum. "Place it next to the other," Jenna suggested, her voice trembling. Maybe together they'll create a shield or something. With a nod, Mia placed her crystal next to the other. As soon as the crystals touched, a blinding light exploded from them, enveloping the group in a dome of radiant energy. The shadows recoiled with screeches of rage, the wind howling as if in pain. Within the dome, the friends huddled together, the crystals at their feet now forming a barrier that seemed to protect them from the dark forces. They watched as the shadows outside darted and thrashed against the light, unable to penetrate the glowing shield. As the night wore on, the attacks grew less frequent, the shadows eventually retreating, leaving the forest eerily quiet once more. As dawn approached, the light from the crystals faded, the dome dissolving into the morning mist. Exhausted but alive, Mia, Tyler, Jenna, and Eric stepped out of the circle, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. They were safe for now, but the night's events had changed them, the reality of dark forces and ancient powers etched into their minds. As they made their way out of the forest, the knowledge that their ordeal might not be over hung heavy in the air. The crystals had protected them, but at what cost? And was the threat truly gone, or just lying in wait, gathering strength for the next unsuspecting soul, brave or foolish?